Welcome to Acura. I'm James Carden, and today I'm pleased to be joined by my friend and colleague, David Speedie. Today's guest joins us from Ireland. Professor Geoffrey Roberts is an internationally acclaimed historian. He is Emeritus Professor of History at University College Cork and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. A recognized world authority on Stalin and the Second World War and the history of Soviet and Russian military and foreign policy, he has published some 30 books and 70 articles, including many translations. He is a reviewer and op-ed writer for the Irish Examiner and the Irish Times, and is a regular contributor to British, Irish, and Russian radio and television programs. His latest book is Stalin's Library, A Dictator and His Books. And he publishes an indispensable list of Russia-related articles on his listserv. So, Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to start by asking you your opinion of President Biden's most recent State of the Union address. If you had the misfortune to actually sit through it. He opened with comments regarding the Russia-Ukrainian war. And here's what he said, in part. Not since President Lincoln and the Civil War have freedom and democracy been under assault here at home as they are today. What makes our moment rare is that freedom and democracy are under attack both at home and overseas at the very same time. Overseas, Putin of Russia is on the march, invading Ukraine and sowing chaos throughout Europe and beyond. If anyone in this room thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you he will not. So, as the author of a very popular recent article about the 10 most egregious historical analogies being used with regard to Russia and Ukraine, what do you make of that?
Well, I'm primarily a historian, as you know. Most of my time in my head, I live in the past, not in the present. So yeah, I'm not. Yeah. In terms of commenting on current affairs, it's not my preferred activity. But I got drawn into writing the kind of article that you mentioned since 2014, since the Ukraine crisis erupted. From that point on, that's when I started to engage more and more with contemporary political issues. Now, it wasn't because until that time I didn't have political views. I had political views, very strong political views about all kinds of aspects of world politics. It's just that I was a historian, so I was focused on my research and I was focused on utilizing what expertise I had. Okay, but I got drawn into the whole Ukraine-Russia problem and issue. Basically because of my historian sensibilities, and fundamentally as a historian I'm dedicated to telling the story from the point of view of the actors involved, because it's only if you can understand their point of view, represent their point of view, you can understand why they did what they did and explain their actions. So that's why I started getting engaged in current affairs commentary, was to actually, I'm a Russian studies specialist, to explain the Russian point of view. And of course that kind of like the activity has kind of increased exponentially, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 22. So when I'm kind of getting involved in this kind of like commentary about, in this case, the Ukraine war. Okay, I have a position on the war, which is quite well-known position, which is, I oppose the invasion, but I'm also oppose the Western proxy war on Ukraine. I want the war to end as soon as possible. I want peace as soon as possible, but one has to be realistic about what that peace is. So I have a kind of political position, but when I'm like talking about the war and writing about the war, much particularly I'm writing about the war, I'm trying to shed some light on the situation to help public understanding. That's my primary goal. Okay, so in answer to your question, no, I didn't actually watch or listen to Biden's State of the Union address. Obviously I read lots of reports about it, and in terms of the bit you picked out there, in a way, it kind of like sums up one of the most kind of intractable problems in relation to the Ukraine war, which is this kind of nexus between domestic politics and foreign politics, yeah, particularly American, domestic politics, because Biden, united the two. So, in many ways, particularly now, American foreign policy, American policy in relation to Ukraine is driven by US domestic politics, not by not by rational calculations of interests and the way that foreign policies normally are conducted. At least that was the case historically, but it's driven by and it's an enormous kind of problem. The most, as far as I can see, the most fundamental block to bringing the war to a rapid end is domestic political considerations in the United States, in Europe, and also and also in Ukraine. So it's a very kind of like, it's a very, very I didn't, when I read about his address, I found it to be very, 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 very disturbing and very depressing about where this conflict is going.
Following up on James's question and your comments, Henry Kissinger once famously said that demonization of Putin is not a policy. However, I think it's become a policy to some extent here in the United States. And to get back to another demon that we love to hate is, of course, Stalin, and that's a major topic of your work, your writing, your research, and so on. And you've been criticized, in at least one case, I think in a major European university banned one of your books, Stalin and his General. So what we tend to see here in Western eyes is to compare, it's popular to compare Putin to Stalin as a tyrant ruling over a malign expansionist state. And that is, of course, I think, counterfactual, but there seems to be a valid comparison inherent in some qualities you've applied to Stalin. You've written about egalitarian, multicultural, internationalist, anti-imperialist. And it seems to me that Putin shares this with Stalin, and he also shares an almost mystical responsibility to protect Russia as a state. You wrote once that socialism was an emotional phenomenon for Stalin. And I think if you heard the first long monologue of Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson, there's the same sort of almost mystical approach. Is that a fair comparison, you think, between the two?
Another kind of disturbing aspect of the current situation is what you started by saying, which is about the demonization of Putin, the demonization of Russia, this characterization as an authoritarian, threatening, expansionist, genocidal, use your own kind of adjective, state. Very, very so actually, I'm a Stalin scholar, and I can tell you, Putin is infinitely much more demonized than Stalin was in his time, or even subsequently, when a lot of the truth about the mass repressions of the Stalin era first became public. So very, 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 yeah. So, but look, there's no comparison between Putin's Russia and Stalin's Russia. They're completely different entities. At worst, Putin's authoritarianism is of the soft variety, certainly compared to the Soviet the Soviet state. Putin is a conservative. He has none of the kind of like utopianism or idealism or messianic ambition that Stalin had as a communist and a Bolshevik. So there's no real comparison to be made between the Putin and the Stalin regimes. Okay, there are some interesting comparisons to be made between Stalin and Putin personally, and you highlighted one there, which is the emotional quality of their intellectuality. Yeah, ideas in both cases have an emotional force for them. for both Stalin and for Putin. And it's that explains, is part of the driving force of the policy that they're pursuing. Another comparison is their interest in history. Yeah, I mean, Putin, well known, expressed many different views on history, and Stalin was the same. You mentioned another comparison we can make, which is about multinationalism. And well, I'm not so sure about. I'm not so sure that you could characterize Putin as an internationalist in the same way that Stalin was an internationalist, but certainly, yeah, in terms of their commitment to the multinational character of the states over which they preside, that's a very strong comparison. And indeed, in the context of the war of Ukraine, or the war with not just Ukraine, but the proxy war with NATO, Putin has very much doubled down on his commitment to the Russian Federation as a multi-ethnic state, and he's very strongly pushed back against trying to turn Russia into some kind of like Russian ethnic state, and the Ukraine war into some kind of like inter-ethnic struggle between Russians and Ukrainians. I suppose the final point about this, in terms of the Stalin-Putin comparison, is how does Putin see Stalin? We see him as a communist, and Putin, okay, he was a communist himself originally, is anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik, sees the Bolsheviks and communists have been very damaging to Russia historically. But Putin's ire against communism and Bolsheviks is mostly directed against Lenin, not Stalin. And the reason for that is that he does see Stalin as a state builder, yeah, and as a patriot, yeah. So I think that's a fundamental overlap in terms of the two men's politics. Their patriotism, okay. In Stalin's case, it's Soviet patriotism. In Putin's case, it's a multi-ethnic, multinational Russian based patriotism. And I always say to people is that, you know, if you want to understand Putin, the most fundamental thing to understand about him is that he is a patriot. He sees himself as a patriot, right? He doesn't see himself as a dictator or an authoritarian. He sees himself as acting in the best interests of Russia and his people. Now, you might want to contest that self-image. You might want to disagree with his actions, and I certainly disagree with a lot of Putin's actions. But there's no doubt whatsoever about, you know, the authenticity of Putin's patriotism.
Well, I think you're hitting on a very important point, and this is something that our colleague Anatol Lieven has spoken and written about a lot, is that there's a misunderstanding with regard to what Putin actually is here in the West. He's often accused, I think wrongly, of being a Russian ethno-nationalist, but Lieven's point is that no, he's a state nationalist. I think that that's very much, you could probably characterize Stalin as such, as a state nationalist, certainly not an ethno-nationalist, since of course he was Georgian. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, in kind of like the Western context, when you're like talking about different varieties of nationalism, you usually talk about, you know, is ethno-nationalism, and then you have like societal or civic kind of nationalism. And societal or civic nationalism is based on values, and it can actually incorporate different ethnic identities. Yes, and there are lots of examples of that. But yeah, so Putin's kind of patriotism, nationalism fits into that category of societal or civic nationalism. Now, you started by saying, you know, about, you know, people not understanding Putin or not getting what Putin. I think that's true, but there's absolutely no excuse for it, given what that Putin is always talking. He's always explaining himself, explaining very explicitly in huge amount of depth, and opening himself up to kind of like tough kind of like questioning from all kinds of different perspectives. And all this, like, you know, material that can help you understand is out there. It's in the public domain. He has his own presidential website, you know, where all his like major statements are recorded. And I always say to people is that whenever you read something in the media, particularly mainstream Western media, that attributes something or other to Putin, don't accept it at face value. Go to what Putin himself said. Go to his presidential website, and so there's actually no excuse for getting Putin wrong, all the information there is public. And there's also some fantastic analysis and writings about Putin. A couple of years ago or so, there was a really good biography of Putin published by Philip Short, and I would urge anyone interested in Putin as a biographical subject to read this particular book. And it's not an uncritical book by any means. It's definitely not a hagiography. So there's kind of no excuse for this kind of caricature, misrepresentation of Putin as a person and as a politician.
You know, when you speak about Putin being very much in the open about his views and etc., I wanted to ask you something about your recent paper, Now or Never, about the Ukraine war, because in it you give a meticulously detailed chronology of Putin in his own words, from basically late 2021 through the invasion of February 2022. Over these 3 months, Putin gives clear notice of willingness to go to war if he deems it necessary to do so to protect Russia from the specter of a nuclear Ukraine in NATO. Even, by the way, as he worked strenuously to try to find a diplomatic solution, and asking the West to please make Ukraine live up to the Minsk agreements and so on. But he says on 12/21, as you say, Russia will take appropriate military technological measure and will have a tough response. So my question is, if Putin is such a bad actor in the eyes of the West, ruthless, out to just simply annex the Ukraine, did anyone in the West pay heed to these statements that he was making, which, we're all convinced were absolutely genuine and reflecting the man? Or put another way, what happened to William Burns's statement in 28 after the Bucharest summit that Ukraine and NATO would be the reddest of lines for Russia? I mean, was anyone paying attention to this, or was it just regarded as Putinist bravado?
It's a very difficult question to answer. How do you explain the kind of things that Burns was saying 10 years or so ago, and with the kind of things he's saying now? And there's a lot of other examples. I think it's just I don't know. The only answer I have is a politically driven and context driven thing. So it suits people to say certain things about Putin, yeah, some of which they may or may not believe, but it fulfills a political kind of role. So obviously, it's a way of rationalizing, justifying Western policies in relation to Russia, and particularly obviously the huge involvement in this proxy war with Russia and in the Ukraine and in the Ukraine context. It just reminded me there was one thing that George Kennan once said. He was talking about Cold War propaganda, and he once said he didn't know what was more disturbing: the fact that there was this propaganda and people said these things, or the fact that they might actually believe these things. I find myself thinking the same, is that what they say is appalling. It's propaganda, is it? It has no substance and basis. I can't quite make up my mind whether or not they believe it, and I'm not certain which is the worst conclusion, whether they do believe it or they don't actually believe it. But going back to your question about my article, okay, so when the invasion started in February 22, like most people, I was actually quite shocked by what had happened. I wasn't that surprised, because it seemed to me that after Putin put forward his proposals for a new set of security arrangements with Russia in December 21, and after the West kind of rebuffed those proposals without making any substantial concessions or entry into any really serious negotiation. It seemed to me that Putin would have to do something, yes, and something quite dramatic and something military. But I have to say, I wasn't prepared for what he actually did in launching this quite large-scale military operation. So I wasn't surprised by what happened, but I was quite shocked. As it happens, the day in which the invasion took place, I was at Auschwitz, and I was doing the Auschwitz tour, actually at Auschwitz. So it was quite a kind of emotional day for me. But this article I wrote called "Now or Never." The immediate origins of Putin's preventative war against Ukraine on Ukraine or against Ukraine. I wrote it to help myself overcome this shock and try to understand what had happened and why Putin had done what he'd done. So I asked myself, as a historian, what's the best evidence that we have to explain Putin's actions? And the best evidence that we have, and still have, it hasn't changed, is what Putin has said about his motivations and his policies, his actions, his explanations, and obviously side by side with what Putin says, with what he actually did. And having and so that's why I just work through the detailed kind of evidence, and primarily it's what Putin said in various speeches and in various press conferences and meetings. And I came to the conclusion that Putin's primary motivation for invading Ukraine was that he feared that Ukraine was being built up into a military enclave on Russia's border, a very nationalistic and anti-Russia Ukraine. And he feared that not immediately, but at some point in the not too distant future, this would become a very big threat to Russian security, right? Including perhaps a nuclear threat. So he took the decision to launch what I call a preventative war against Ukraine, to liquidate that threat before it became too dangerous to Russia. I think he was also concerned and have been concerned for decades actually, but certainly going back to 2014, he was also concerned about the fate of pro-Russian or Russian-speaking Ukrainians and the problems of persecution and issues that they were facing, particularly in the Donbass. But until that issue about a commitment to try and do what he could to protect pro-Russian Ukrainians, that had been ongoing, at least since 2014. Yeah, so that in itself is not the explanation for his decision to launch this special military operation. So so my conclusion was that the primary reason for the special military operation, it's a preventative war waged to actually to liquidate this emerging and dire existential security threat to Russia.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I would say that, he and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, have always been very, very clear about their intention. Whether this policy is legal under international law or not is another question, about protecting Russian minorities within the former states of the Soviet Union. So that was certainly, it seems to me, a part of it. I want to now sort of get into, as we look to wrap up, the current state of the war on the ground. There have been reports over the past couple of days that of Russian drone strikes in Odessa. So the war seems to be moving westward. And you, as it happens, have a very, very good article titled "How Far Will He Go? Putin's Territorial Goals in Ukraine." So given what we've seen over the past couple of weeks, how far will he go? What are we looking at as 2024 unfolds, in your opinion?
I think how far it goes, it depends on the course of the war, right? If the war was to end in the near future, in the next few weeks, or begin to definitely come to an end, then perhaps he wouldn't go much further than he's gone already. That's to say, in territorial terms, he would be content with the incorporation of the four additional provinces and Crimea into which have already been incorporated into the Russian state, into the Russian Federation constitutionally. He'd be content with completing Russian conquest of the Donbass and gaining that territory on a permanent basis, plus the neutralization of Ukraine in some form, which would effectively wouldn't so much be about the neutralization of Ukraine. It would be about the neutralization of NATO and the Western threat to Russia through its Ukraine proxy. But of course, the war, may not end in the next few weeks. And the longer the war goes on, the more likely it is that Putin's territorial, political, and ideological goals will become more expansive, more ambitious, more radical in response to necessity. So if to actually win the war, to achieve the goals of the special military operation, which is fundamentally the neutralization of Ukraine, if that requires Russian forces going on to capture Odessa, Kharkov, or advancing all the way to the eastern banks of the Dnieper, then that is what is going to happen. Okay, so what is that going to happen? I'm not sure. I hope that what's going to happen in the next few weeks is that Russia is going to gain a decisive military advantage over Ukraine, and it will be seen to be so decisive that it's actually threatening a significant Russian victory in the war in the short term. If that happens, then maybe the Ukrainians in the West will come to their senses and start embrace diplomacy and start negotiating some kind of ceasefire and peaceful. But we don't know whether that's going to happen. Even in the face of catastrophic military defeat, Ukraine might be able to fight on with Western support, and Western states might actually decide that that's the better option. And it goes back to that question you asked me at the beginning about Biden and his State of the Union address, the role that domestic politics and the loss of political face is playing in driving the ongoing Western commitment to Ukraine. Whatever the price, it's going to be paid by Ukraine. So I hope the war is going to come to an end as soon as possible for Ukraine's sake. But I'm not optimistic that is going to be the case. But obviously, clearly, what's in terms of the battlefield situation, it's very clear. I think apart from virtually everyone, from all perspectives and all sides, I think would agree that Russia is winning the war at the moment, and there is no possibility of Ukraine winning the war. The outcome of the war is going to be some kind of Russian victory. Exactly what kind, we don't know. But that I think we've certainly reached that point where we can firmly say that that Russia is going to win this war. Unless, of course, we have intervening events which completely change the whole picture. And of course, the great threat we face is that Western desperation might actually lead them to escalate their support for Ukraine to dangerous levels, to undertake actions which could actually spark off a chain of escalation. Russia is going to win in Ukraine, barring some kind of major escalation, which will result in everyone, the whole world, losing from this war.
James, do we have any time left, or are we?
Sure. Last question
okay.
from you, David.
I wanted to completely change the subject and ask you about Stalin's Library. I haven't read it yet, but I'm intrigued as to what drew you to the books of the great man. Do the books speak to the man, or the books describe the man? What's your particular interest? Obviously, you're a historian, and this reveals a lot about Stalin. But I'd be interested to hear your specific.
I'm always happy to answer questions about history because we can actually base it on evidence, a lot of evidence, rather than just speculation. Because of course, when we're trying to understand the Ukraine war, when it's hesitant to sort of make too strong, all right, anyway, too strong a case, because okay, I follow the war, I follow the media in detail, great detail, but there's a lot of stuff I don't know and can't know, which leads me to be a bit circumspect in judging what's going on. But when it comes to history, at least certain history, of course, we have a lot more evidence at disposal. Okay, and the reason I wrote this particular book, Stalin's Library, was because there was available this body of evidence in the form of the remnants of Stalin's personal book collection, right, including several hundred of these books which he had marked, in some way, in many cases actually written in, commented on, right? So this source is the most intimate source we have available about Stalin. Okay, we have lots of, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, you opened up the Russian archives, we have a huge amount of primary source material in relation to Stalin. You go into the Russian archives and you look at the Soviet period, Stalin's fingerprints are all over, or all over the document, So we do have a huge amount of evidence anyway, but there's nothing more kind of intimate, more personal, more revealing than how Stalin, what books Stalin read, what books he collected, his concept of his library, and how he read them and how he responded to them in many ways, right? Okay. So it brings you closer to Stalin's most kind of private, personal thinking, yeah. Okay, and what I do in the book is I present this evidence alongside all kinds of other evidence as well, and I present an intellectual portrait of Stalin, and its intellectual portrait enables us to understand Stalin as a political figure, as a political leader, and understand his motivations, and provides the key to interpreting many specific in particular episodes in his career. But there's one big thing that I learned from this research, which I didn't know before, and it goes back to what you made the point, David, about Putin's kind of emotionality. Yes, the emotionality. I didn't realize until I wrote this book. Okay, I knew that Stalin was an intellectual, but I didn't realize to what extent Stalin was an emotionally based intellectual, to what extent he cared and felt about his ideas and what he read, and how motivating that emotional commitment to his ideology, to his movement, his cause was. Okay, and the thing is this is not just a speculation on my part. I'm not making it up. You can see that. You can see that in this source I'm talking about, his personal book collection. It's that you can see it in the way he read books and how he marked his pages, right? And going back to the Putin view. Okay, so I wrote this article in which, on the basis of Putin's public statements, I put forward a particular interpretation of his decision to invade Ukraine. But I'm not certain that I'm right, and I won't be certain. No one will be certain until we have a lot more more confidential, more intimate information, evidence in relation to Putin and in this particular decision making process. So, for example, history is obviously important to Putin, but how important is it? Yeah. What history has Putin actually read? What's in his personal book collection? Right? Does Putin mark his books? Maybe there's a Putin personal library that someone in the future will be able to have a look at.
What if it's on Kindle?
No, but that's a very good point. No, but that's a good point, and that's very disturbing from a historian's point of view. Is that a lot of the confidential, the decision-making material is not in a very exists in not in very robust form. It exists, electronically. The storage of it is not guaranteed to last for a long time. Now, the interesting thing is, I understand that Putin's a bit of a technophobe. That he doesn't. He doesn't even have a mobile phone. Now that might be for like security reasons.
Wow.
But that suggests to me that possibly, and also, my guess would be he's pretty old-fashioned in terms of how he wants to be briefed, and how he wants decisions to be recorded. And then, given his background in the Soviet tradition, where everything was written down and recorded and very, very specific, we might find in relation to Putin that the confidential information about his decision making is actually quite extensive and robust. So I'm hopeful from that point of view. But of course, it will be many years, maybe even decades, before we get access to that material. But having said that, in terms of my particular article, the now or never article, okay, it's based on public sources, but I'm fairly confident that most of what it says will hold water, that it won't be refuted by subsequent evidence. I think it will. I think it will be enriched, and and maybe I might even amend it and change it myself at some point in the future. But I don't think it's going to be fundamentally undermined. And the reason I say this is because, okay, so I spent years of my life working in various archives, particularly Russian archives, and one of the things and any historian will tell you this, is that what you read in the archives isn't actually much different from what you can read in the newspapers or what's being said in public. The private discourse and the public discourse, they're not separate discourse, they're one discourse. There's a continuity there. So I'm pretty certain that Putin's public statements explaining what he's doing and why he's doing it are broadly similar to what he's saying in private as well. Right. So I think the public is fundamentally revealing of his private or more confidential decision making.
Well, thank you very much for all of that and for joining us. This was a really fascinating conversation, and we're running out of time, unfortunately. So we hope to have you back. So thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much for the invitation. Thanks for the questions.
Thanks, Jeff. Bye-bye.